Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Stroum Lecture for 2008. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Michael Walzer to you. 40 years ago, I entered the doctoral program at Harvard University in the government department. At that time, Michael Walzer had recently returned to Harvard from teaching in Princeton. And as I asked around the department what courses I should take and what professors I should study with, there was a kind of buzz about this young professor who had come from Princeton. And I was told I should definitely take his graduate seminar. And I made it my business to do just that. And what an experience it was. I marveled at both the substance of what we were learning and his facility with that substance and his style. On substance, he and in another seminar I had, his colleague Dieter Sklar, were introducing me to a new world, a set of texts with which I had been totally unfamiliar. The important modern political philosophers who had shaped the way we think about the world and about politics from the 15th and 16th centuries on, Michael concentrating on the more recent centuries. And there was a freshness of insight that I found breathtaking at the time. It was truly an incredible experience. Sklar and Walzer mined those texts, taught me how to do close readings of them, and they opened new worlds to me. On style, I was equally impressed. Michael Walzer taught his seminars in a very distinctive style. It was a deliberate, sometimes I thought even halting style, which had me, and I think the other students as well, believing that he was thinking through the difficult issues of these texts as he spoke to us. And maybe he was. It was a style certainly that brought the students into this thinking, made them a part of this process, and enabled them, or maybe forced them, to join him in the painful but delightful process of thinking things through. After I earned my PhD, I left Harvard. I went to Israel and taught there for 3 years. And then I returned again to Harvard as a young professor. And now I had the privilege of being Michael Walzer's colleague. But unbeknownst to him, I was still learning from him as I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a professional academic. And I remember one time where he described, I don't even know if he remembers this, he described how he writes philosophy, political philosophy. And what he said then greatly affected my own writing process. He said that he sits and writes at a desk and then stops and looks up. And he looks and sees all his philosophical colleagues, who are all dead, of course. Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau and all the others. And they're standing there in the room with him. And he looks at them and says, "Is what I wrote okay?" And if they nod, he can proceed. I think that these lectures will demonstrate to you the extraordinary thinker and teacher that Michael Walzer is. I present Michael Walzer.
Thank you, Joel. Well, this is the second of 3 lectures, and I will just remind you of their subject matter. I am talking about 3 sets of political actors who appear in the Hebrew Bible: kings, prophets, and elders. And I am trying to figure out what the biblical writers thought about these figures and the role that they play in political life. Today, the prophets, who are, as you know, we read them as moral teachers, and read that way, their books, or selected parts of their books, are the biblical texts most accessible to contemporary men and women. For us, the prophets are poets of social justice, utopian visionaries. Now, I'm not going to dispute that reading this evening, only try to complicate it. For prophecy was a political role in ancient Israel, and the importance of the role has as much to do with the way it was played as with the lines delivered by the players, though there are many wonderful lines. So I want to consider the audience of the prophets and the public spaces in which they spoke, and above all, the very important fact that they spoke in public to an audience. In a recent book about political morality, the British philosopher Stuart Hampshire argued that a certain kind of public speech is a universal feature of human societies. And this is what he says: wherever and whenever human societies exist, whether they are primitive or technologically advanced, issues of policy, political issues, will be debated in some assembly of chosen persons. The institution of articulating and reviewing contrary opinions on policy is of necessity species-wide, universal. What Hampshire is describing here is deliberation, practical reasoning, the essence of politics according to the Greeks. So is there anything like deliberation in the Bible? Certainly the kings that I described last time had advisors, but we are told very little about what the advisors said or how they spoke. Mostly, the search for knowledge of God's will replaces discussions about human policy. Oracle replaces argument. Now, the Greeks also consulted oracles, but this was secondary to the processes of public debate and decision. I assume that there was debate and decision in ancient Israel too, of necessity, as Hampshire says, but we get only glimpses of the process in the biblical texts. The author of the post-biblical first book of Maccabees expresses admiration for the Roman Republic where, and I'm quoting, every day 320 senators constantly deliberate concerning the people. Perhaps he hoped to see a similar regime established in Jerusalem. But nothing like constant deliberation is described for the previous 1,000 years. Samuel argues with the elders about the advantages and disadvantages of kingship. Absalom, David's son, David's rebellious son, consults his advisors on the strategies of rebellion. Rehoboam receives the conflicting advice of the old men and the young men. There aren't many other examples. At best, this sort of thing is simply taken for granted by biblical writers. It's a background politics that doesn't arouse their interest. What is up front is very different. We read almost nothing in the Bible about assemblies and councils, though both probably existed, and there must have been conventions about the forms of speech appropriate within them. No doubt the elders of Israel spoke to one another. What they said, however, doesn't seem to have been recorded. We find instead a typically one-sided discourse that has its origin in divine revelation. God speaking at Sinai, Moses' orations in Deuteronomy, and prophetic declamation. Abraham and Moses talk back to God, arguing against his destructive anger. Abraham for the sake of the people of Sodom, and Moses for the sake of Israel itself. The prophet Amos, reporting a vision in chapter 7 of his book, claims briefly to have played Moses' part, defending the people of Israel. No one else attempts a similar argument. When the prophets plead Israel's cause, they don't do so in a dialogue with God, nor do they speak independently of his instigation. Their claim to be heard derives from a previous claim that they speak the word of the Lord. The prophetic books, nonetheless, provide some of the most interesting, arresting examples of dialogue in the Bible. Samuel and Saul, Nathan and David, Elijah and Ahab, Amos and Amaziah, Jeremiah and Hananiah, Jeremiah again and Zedekiah, Haggai, and the priests. And much more of what the prophets say, though not deliberative in character, is certainly argumentative. We can readily imagine what the text rarely provides, and that is the opposing positions, the words that are not the words of the Lord. In the case of Moses, who is called the first prophet, the opposing positions, the murmuring of the people, or Korach's challenge, the opposing positions are actually recorded in the text. It's Moses' arguments that are mostly missing. Since he can call for miracles and terrible punishments, he doesn't need to argue. Later prophets have no such intimate connection with God and so lack anything like Moses' authority. They are commonly resisted, disputed, denied their title. And the prophet's title can only be vindicated by his words. Though other tests are proposed, and I'll talk about them, the true test is this: by his words shall you know him, by his eloquence, his poetic power, his argumentative skill. In the prophetic books, we find the most important forms of public speech in ancient Israel. But what kind of political speech is this? Excluding Moses, whose position is unique in biblical history, the prophet as a political figure first appears together with the king. We can think of the two as a double replacement for the charismatic judges, like Gideon and Samson and Deborah. Kings take on the military and judicial roles of the judges, though in a more institutionalized way. They hire mercenaries and create standing armies. And though they don't often sit in judgment themselves, they seem to appoint or confirm the men increasingly likely to be professionals who do sit in judgment. And prophets take on the charisma of the judges, the immediate divine connection. The prophets are raised up by God the way the judges were, while kings, after David, are born to their tasks and raised at court. In the northern kingdom, where dynastic rule was never firmly established, new kings were anointed by prophets, or they were usurpers without legitimacy. But in Judah, in the southern kingdom, after David, there is a steady succession until the Babylonian conquest and exile. And there's a striking similarity in the appointment of David and of Amos the prophet. David the king and Amos the prophet. Here is God speaking to David. I took thee from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people. And here is Amos reporting his appointment. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock and said unto me, go, prophesy unto my people. But David is the last king so taken, while Amos is only the first of a series of prophets who have left a written record of the moment when they were called by God. Though there were court prophets and there were temple prophets, prophecy is not an office, it is a calling. Each prophet is individually called. There is no prophetic covenant like the priestly covenant with Aaron and his descendants or the royal covenant with David and his descendants. Hence, there are no prophetic genealogies. Mostly we're given only a father's name, sometimes only a place. Amos, who was among the herdsmen of Tekoa, or Micah the Morasthite. Elijah is the only prophet to appoint a successor. If there were prophetic schools or circles, if prophets had followers, they had no heirs, at least no heirs with names. No prophet after Elisha was the disciple of another prophet. Kings and priests were uniformly members of a ruling or an upper class. Even the new kings of the northern kingdom were not taken from the sheepfold. They were royal officials or military commanders. Prophets, by contrast, were drawn from every social strata. The social range of prophecy was determined by the radical inclusiveness of the national covenant. Hence, the divine call could come unexpectedly to anyone, even to women who rarely take public roles in the Bible. There were no female priests and no queens except the usurper Athaliah. But women were called to be judges, like Deborah, and prophets, like Huldah. This means, of course, that anyone could claim that he or she had been called, and it also means that any claim could be disputed. But what were the stakes? What was at stake in the disputes? The prophets of Israel made no claim to rule the country, nor did they ever organize anything remotely resembling a political party or a movement or even a sect. When power is at stake, strict standards of legitimacy are normally worked out, and so kingship and priesthood were subject, at least in principle, to genealogical proof. The standards were looser for prophets, no doubt because the stakes were lower. The prophets demanded only to be heard, and there's no reason to doubt that significant numbers of them were heard, listened to, though not necessarily hearkened to, in the centuries that stretch from Samuel's time to Malachi's. Kings, no doubt, chose their favorite prophets, in much the same way that presidents and prime ministers choose their academic advisors today. The kings wanted favorable forecasts, just as their contemporary counterparts do. And this seems to be what prophets had to offer. The crucial asset that they derive from their calling is the ability to read the future. And so if they cannot make policy, they are indispensable advisors to policy makers. But their advice, again, is always disputed. Deuteronomy chapter 18 provides the official standard by which all these disputes about callings and foretellings are supposed to be resolved. And it is the obvious standard. When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing that he says follow not, nor come to pass, that is a thing that the Lord hath not spoken, but the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously. Now, that isn't much help at the moment of prophecy. But I suppose that in an age of almost continual warfare, prophets might acquire a reputation for accurate military forecasts or for inaccuracy and presumption. But long-term prophecies dealing with the future of the dynasty or the kingdom are essentially untestable by this standard. Prophecies of disaster, of course, have a way of being fulfilled if one waits long enough. And it may be that prophets like Amos were remembered, their words preserved, and then finally canonized because of fulfillments of this sort. I suspect, however, that the Deuteronomic test worked only in the short run and was probably overridden even there often enough by the king's preference for favorable oracles. And there were certainly prophets ready to provide what the king wanted. Consider the story in the first book of Kings, chapter 22, about Ahab, King Ahab of the northern kingdom, and his 400 prophets, all of whom recited in unison whatever the king wanted to hear. King Jehoshaphat of Judah, Ahab's ally in a war against the Syrians, was skeptical, apparently, about such recitations and asked for one more prophet, a second opinion. "There is yet one man," replied Ahab, "Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." Micaiah is called and prophesies defeat at the hands of the Syrians. The kings march into battle anyway and are indeed defeated. From this case, the rabbis derived another standard of prophetic reliability. The authentic prophet speaks in his own voice and his own manner. Beware the multitude of prophets, all of whom say the same thing. Unanimity is a mark of inauthenticity. But this standard is best applied to prophets who speak at length and in public. Micaiah himself, like other war prophets, has very little to say and nothing at all of larger political significance. What makes prophecy truly significant is not the oracle or the military forecast, but the moral admonition. And these two are connected, for admonitions can be understood as conditional oracles. You, the king, will lose the war, or your dynasty will fall, or your kingdom will be destroyed, so speaks the prophet in God's name, unless you repent for this or that sinful action and cleave henceforth to the covenantal law. Now the prophet is less foreteller than critic, and he will have to speak in his own voice, for the critical role requires courage, which most of his fellow prophets, like Ahab's 400, clearly lack. And since the people he is criticizing won't want to listen, he will have to insist upon his calling and find some way to vindicate it. But there's no way to prove that his words are divine except to speak them divinely. The prophet is in practice dependent upon his eloquence. We can see this eloquence even in the case of court prophecy, which can be dramatic and powerful at the same time as it is brief and unelaborated. Thus, you'll remember the story of Nathan, the prophet, who comes to talk to David after his affair with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. And he tells David a parable, a story. And the culminating line decoding the parable is, "Thou art the man. You are the seducer and the murderer." Or you'll also remember Elijah's confrontation with Ahab after the murder of Naboth and the seizure of his vineyard. "Hast thou killed and also taken possession?" But eloquence rises to its occasions, and the decisive occasions come when the prophet leaves the relative privacy of the royal court and speaks at large to the people. The great poetry of the prophetic books is spoken in public. The books themselves were probably added to and revised in the course of oral or written transmission, and some of the specific foretellings may have been amended so as to meet the Deuteronomic test. But even today, when many of the references are unclear and many lines obscure, the prophetic writings are best read out loud. At the time they were spoken, they were also contested out loud in public by other prophets, by royal officials, and even by ordinary Israelites. Some of the contestations are recorded or described in the prophetic books. Only occasionally, however, do we hear two or more voices. The priest Amaziah, as well as Amos, I'll talk about that, the enemies of Jeremiah, as well as the prophet himself. More often, we have only one-sided denunciations of other prophets who are called conformists, flatterers, and time servers. They speak the smooth words that, says Isaiah, the people want to hear. And sometimes the smooth words actually come true, as in the victories of Jeroboam II, foretold by Jonah, the son of Amittai, a contemporary and probably an opponent of Amos. And when the smooth words come true, their speakers are not without credibility as prophets. At the same time, the cacophony of prophetic voices, the endless disputes, must have generated a considerable distrust, so that our prophets, the authors of the biblical books, repeatedly dissociate themselves from the whole enterprise. I was no prophet, says Amos, neither was I the son of a prophet, but I was a herdsman, and so on, taken from the flock. These words from the first of the literary prophets are echoed by one of the last, Zechariah, who seems to warn his listeners against Amos's strategy of dissociation. And it shall come to pass in that day, says Zechariah, that the prophet shall be ashamed, every one of his vision. And he shall say, I am no prophet, I am a husbandman, for they taught me to keep cattle from my youth. Exactly what prompted these last words we can only imagine. They come at the end of a long history of acrimonious and often ad hominem arguments between true and false prophets. But a few recorded instances of argument ease the way for our imaginations. What these texts suggest is something rather different from Hampshire's review of policy options. Though policy was at stake, and mostly foreign policy, that is, whether to march to war or join a military alliance or negotiate a surrender, the immediate focus was always on the prophet's credentials, his divine authorization, and not on the policy issues. Because if he really spoke in God's name, there was no point in arguing with him. There was no point in soliciting other opinions. But could someone who prophesied disaster for God's people possibly be speaking in God's name? This is the form the arguments commonly took. Public speech, certainly, but a very indirect kind of deliberation. The authors of the prophetic books were fully engaged in these arguments, and there's no evidence, except for the preservation of their books, that the strategy of dissociation, the denial that they were really prophets, worked. They were undoubtedly prophets, a small group among the hundreds or possibly thousands of others. They spoke more truthfully, perhaps, or more eloquently, but they were of the same kind. Together with their opponents, they made the northern shrines like Bethel and the streets and courtyards of Jerusalem lively, if not yet genuinely political places. We don't know precisely when the prophets left the royal court and moved into the public spaces of Israel's cities and towns. Elijah and Elisha travel around the country, but they are more like miracle workers, legendary heroes, the disarmed successors of the warrior judges, more like that than public speakers. At least we have no record of their speeches. Amos is the first prophet of whom we can say with certainty that he delivered his prophecies to a general audience at the shrine of Bethel in the northern kingdom. He refers to earlier figures, unnamed, who tried to do the same thing and were silenced. But ye commanded the prophets, saying, prophesy not. His contemporaries, Jonah, son of Amittai in the north, and an earlier Zechariah in the south, were still courtiers, speaking, so far as we know, only to kings. Later prophets still had court connections, or some of them did. Isaiah advised King Hezekiah, and Jeremiah, who had friends among royal officials, was consulted at the very end, but not heeded by King Zedekiah. But these two and all the others now had another place. Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there his word, says Jeremiah. Shrine and city, the street, the gate, even the temple court. The importance, I can't overestimate the importance of these new locations. When he spoke only to the king, the prophet was working presumably on the assumption that the king's decision was the only one that counted. The history books still seem to reflect this view. The fate of Israel as a whole is tied relentlessly to the failures of its kings. But when the prophet speaks in public, the working assumption shifts. Now it appears to matter that ordinary men and women think this way or that way, live or don't live in accordance with the law. For if they have no part to play, no responsibility for the policies of the kingdom, why is the prophet commanded to speak to them? From Amos on, the prophets have less and less to say about the particular sins of kings. They address the whole society, though they always recognize its hierarchical character, and some of the people are more responsible than others. Amos denounces the rich with their summer houses and winter houses, couches of ivory, wines and perfumes. They take interest from their brethren. They falsify weights and measures. They bribe the judges. They sell the poor into debt slavery. Isaiah and Jeremiah refer more directly, but also more obscurely, to the political power structure. We have a picture in our mind of the people, or the sort of people described by Amos. They are, so to speak, the local bourgeoisie. But when Isaiah says that the Lord will bring this charge against the elders and officers of his people, it is you who have ravaged the vineyard. When we hear that, we are on less familiar territory. The elders and the officers are men of the state, not men of the market. And how the state functioned, how its functionaries were selected, exactly what their functions were, we know only in a rough way. Here, the biblical texts provide fewer details and imagery far less rich, as if the writers and speakers were uninterested in the textures of political life or were relying on the all too intimate understanding of their audience. In any case, the crucial point is this: all these people, the rich and the powerful, are denounced in the hearing of the others, the poor, the weak, the needy. Not that the others are exonerated. Jeremiah leaves no one out, from the top to the bottom of the political hierarchy, when he foretells the destruction of Jerusalem because of all the evil which they have done to provoke me. They, their kings, their princes, their priests, and their prophets, and the men of Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And in the standard prophetic trope of the divine lawsuit, it is Israel as a whole, the whole community, that sits in the dock, charged with violating covenant law. For the Lord has a case against his people. He has a suit against Israel, says Micah. But the prophets never call upon ordinary Israelites to act politically, actually to take responsibility for public policy. All that their indictment requires is a moral reformation, an end to idolatrous worship, fair dealing in the marketplace, Sabbath observance, compassion for the poor. The demands made on the powerful are of a kind that leave them in place and in power. Honest law enforcement from royal officials, justice from judges, pious instruction from priests, truth from prophets. What is subversive in the prophetic books is not most immediately the message, but the speaking of the message. And of course, the person of the messenger, the divinely called, self-appointed prophet, the embodiment of charisma without power, which is always a threat to power without charisma. But the threat went both ways, and it seems likely that true prophets were as much threatened as threatening. We can get some sense of their political impact, or lack of it, by looking closely now at two recorded confrontations outside the royal court between prophecy and authority. The first brings Amos face to face with the priest Amaziah at the shrine in Bethel. Amos takes the initiative, uninvited. He prophesies the destruction of the northern kingdom. The priest responds in what will be to you an all too familiar way. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to Jeroboam, king of Israel, saying, Amos hath conspired against thee in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear his words. For thus Amos saith, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel shall surely be led away captive out of their own land. Also Amaziah said unto Amos, O thou seer, go flee into the land of Judah, and there eat bread and prophesy there. But prophesy not again any more at Bethel, for it is the king's chapel, and it is the king's court. Now, Amos answers Amaziah with the lines I've already quoted, denying that he's one of the prophets. That's not the way he earns his bread. Then, defying the ban, he prophesies once more in Bethel, foretelling this time the destruction of the priest and his family, and then leaves the shrine or is forcibly removed. At least he is not reported there again. Amaziah's conspiracy charge was almost certainly false. Nothing in Amos's book or in any other of the prophetic books suggests so forward a political move. In any case, Amos is acting publicly, not secretly, in the midst of the house of Israel. Presumably, what really worried the priest was the possible effect of Amos's oracles and admonitions on the listening people. But this worry, too, may have been misplaced. The land seems to have borne the prophetic words easily enough. We're not told how the actual worshipers at Bethel responded to Amos. They did not, at any rate, rally to his defense or protest his banishment, nor does he, responding to Amaziah, make any appeal to the people. Amos is not a popular tribune, even though more than any of the other prophets, he speaks out of a deep compassion for the oppressed. He is God's representative, no one else's. And had God sent him back to Bethel, he would have returned and accepted whatever punishment the king ordained, but conspiracy was someone else's business. Actually, there were prophets who conspired against kings. Ahijah had a role in the rebellion of the first Jeroboam against Solomon's son, and Elisha sent one of his followers, an unnamed prophet, to anoint Jehu and perhaps also to plan his coup d'etat. But these were not speaking prophets. In neither case, in fact, did they warn the king against whom they plotted, and they seem to have had no concern at all with the sins of elders, officers, priests, or people. In Amos's case, given his account of Israel's condition, it would hardly have helped much to anoint a new king. What was necessary was moral reform, and, though he never says so, social transformation, and for this Amos had no agents, or at least no new agents. He relied on the very people he condemned. The second confrontation that I want to look at is sometimes called the trial of Jeremiah, though what is reported in chapter 26 of Jeremiah's book, what is reported is something less than a formal judicial procedure. The prophet, standing in the temple court in Jerusalem, delivered a prophecy of doom for the temple and the city, holding open, however, the possibility that God would repent if the people hearken and turn every man from his evil way. As soon as he finished, the priests and the prophets and all the people took him, saying, "Thou shalt surely die." Jeremiah's crime, they believed or hoped, was false prophecy. The princes or officers of Judah, hearing of the incident, came from the palace to the temple and sat down in the entry of the new gate, sat down presumably in judgment in the entry of the new gate. The priests and the prophets repeated their charge, the people now among the listeners. "This man is worthy to die, for he hath prophesied against this city." Jeremiah, in turn, repeats his conditional prophecy, addressing himself to the officers and people. "As for me, behold, I am in your hand. Do with me as seemeth good unto you. Though if they kill him," he says, "they will kill an innocent man, for of a truth the Lord hath sent me." The officers and the people now support Jeremiah against the priests and prophets, and additional support comes from certain of the elders of the land who remind the assembly that the prophet Micah had also prophesied doom for Jerusalem and had not been put to death by King Hezekiah. So here is a precedent in Jeremiah's favor, and Micah is actually quoted, the only instance of explicit interprophetic citation in the Bible. But then another case is brought, another precedent, that of a prophet named Urijah, who prophesied according to all the words of Jeremiah, and who was fetched forth out of Egypt, where he had fled, and killed by King Jehoiakim. At this point, the narrative breaks off with a summary note that is not quite the report of a judicial verdict, and it ends like this: "Nevertheless, the hand of Ahikam the son of Shaphan was with Jeremiah, that they should not give him into the hands of the people to put him to death." Ahikam the son of Shaphan is an official of the palace. So it's an extraordinary story, unfortunately incomplete, whose exact meaning has been the subject, as you can imagine, of much scholarly debate. I want to make only one point, that though the prophet's speech is taken very seriously by all the parties who join in the discussion, his call for a turning away from evil is never discussed. The question of interest is whether this man, Jeremiah, speaks in God's name. What are his credentials? The political question, what ought to be done now in Jerusalem, is never discussed. The political question doesn't arise. Now, we can guess that it did, in fact, arise from the involvement of Ahikam, who was one of the reforming officials in Josiah's court, and who must have had a lively interest in policy matters. But even in Josiah's time, King Josiah, all that we're told about Ahikam is that he, together with other royal officials, carried the newly discovered book of the law, which we think is Deuteronomy, carried the newly discovered book to the prophetess Huldah for authentication. The question of interest then was whether this was God's book, not whether its laws made political or moral sense. Still, Ahikam must have been engaged in answering the latter question also, and he must have been, with Jeremiah, an advocate of reform, in opposition perhaps to the priests and prophets of the temple. But which evil ways, from which evil ways did Israel have to turn in order to escape God's anger? The prophets offer a full catalog of possibilities, and we can read their lists as programs, therefore as political arguments of a kind. But they don't suggest priorities or propose a strategic ranking. What the royal reformers finally chose as a turning back to the law, what they finally chose very late in the day with the Babylonian army nearing Jerusalem, was a turning away from oppression, a release of debt slaves. And the release was accomplished, interestingly, by a covenant rather than a decree. According to Jeremiah chapter 34, then King Zedekiah made a covenant with all the people to proclaim liberty. So Israel turned or returned to the codes of Exodus and Deuteronomy, apparently long neglected. When the Babylonian army was diverted by an Egyptian attack, the covenant was broken and the former slaves were forced back into servitude. Jeremiah immediately protested, and his words suggest that he was one of the instigators of the reform. But how the choice was made, who opposed it, apart from the slaveholders, and who supported it, and what they said at the necessary meetings, all this is concealed from view. It is not in our text. The trial is reported, the deliberations not. So the prophets were social critics, among other things, perhaps the first social critics in the recorded history of the West. Though the attention of the biblical writers is focused unwaveringly on their authority or lack of it, the texts also provide at great length their arguments, invocations of Israel's history, references to the law codes, descriptions and indictments of current practices, including ritual practices, which were the province of the priests, and legal practices, which were the province of royal officials, and sharp attacks on the foreign policies of both northern and southern kings. I can't address the substance of these arguments here. I only want to insist that the substance must also have been debated by the prophet's contemporaries in some institutional setting, as well as in city streets and temple courtyards. For the authority question, the prophet's credentials, that was never settled, and indeed could never be settled. It isn't only that religious charisma breaks through all authority structures and calls into question all processes of authorization. Equally important is the fact that social criticism, prophetic denunciation, can never be institutionally, legally authoritative. Once the prophet is in the streets, all we can do is listen to whatever he has to say and judge its value for ourselves. Court prophets and temple prophets speak with the authority of court and temple, which reinforces, and so we are likely to think, constrains what they can say. But the streets and the gates and the courtyards add no authority. Now the prophet is on his own. He has to convince us that his words are God's words, that his indictments are true, and that his reforms will work. I've already said that the prophet is known by his eloquence, but by eloquence here I don't mean merely his choice of words or the rhythm of his sentences. He has to use language in a way that engages the mind and touches the heart of his listeners. He has to remind them of what they know, evoke their own historical memories, play on the nerves of their commitment, their guilt, their hopes for the future. Eloquence is a cultural, not even primarily, a linguistic phenomenon. But the culture on which the prophets drew, whose resources they deployed, was a religious, not a political culture. When kings and prophets divided the functions of the charismatic judges, the kings took on the political work, for which there was very little cultural support or reinforcement. Even David and Solomon, the great kings of Israel, even David and Solomon are celebrated more for writing psalms, cultivating wisdom, and building the temple than for organizing, expanding, and running the state. The prophets became the representatives of God in the world, with no practical tasks except criticism. They spoke for the tradition, a history of miraculous interventions, a covenantal law divinely revealed. The more they stressed the miracles and the revelations, the less value there appeared to be in the work of kings. A royal reformer might be welcomed by the prophets, though Jeremiah was skeptical of the Josianic Reformation. But a serious alliance seems unlikely. No prophet, once prophecy had emerged from the court into the streets, showed any interest in the politics of reform or any readiness for the compromises this might require. Their unreadiness, indeed, was what made them so radical. But theirs was a fiercely anti-political radicalism. Prophecy was a kind of public speech that militated against deliberation. The word of God overrode the wisdom of men. They speak words, declared Hosea scornfully, meaning mere words, human words, the politic speech of the rulers of Israel and their courtly advisors. They speak words, they swear falsely, they make covenants, and judgment springeth up like a poisonous weed in the furrows of their field. The judgments of the prophets were entirely different because their words were the words of the Lord. Thank you.